Good evening, everyone. I'm Lisa Taransky. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer at the Coastal Conservation League. And for those of you who are not familiar with our organization and are learning about it for the first time, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Charleston with offices in Beaufort and Georgetown and Columbia. And we are dedicated to the protection of coastal resources and the coastal plain and the quality of life that we enjoy here on the coast of South Carolina. We've been around since 1989, and we were founded by Mr. Dana Beach, who's front row here, who you'll hear from later tonight. And we have grown into an organization of a great staff dedicated to issues that you'll hear about tonight. And I wanted to just take a quick moment if the staff from the Coastal Conservation League could stand up, because we're going to have mingling. Mostly in the back of the room now, right here. A special thanks to Christy Collins, who worked tirelessly to put this event together tonight. She does a great job with our events at the Conservation League. Alan Hancock and Katie Ford Smith in the back of the blue dress are our digital advocacy and communications team. So if you would like to learn more about how to reach us on Facebook or on the internet or Twitter or Instagram, you can join me for a lesson on Instagram. I need to learn more about Instagram. So these are your people right here. Please reach out to them tonight or in the future to learn more. And then Jason Crowley and Emily Sedso are the program directors who work on our resiliency issues, both on the urban side and the rural infrastructure. So be sure if you have any questions after tonight's program to flag them down and make sure you get some answers from them. Before we get started tonight with the program, we have a special guest. Mayor John Tecklenburg has joined us, and he would like to say a few words to kick us off.
Thank you, Lisa, and good evening, everyone. Welcome. I want to thank John Winthrop for sponsoring this event and the Coastal Conservation League. Thank you, Dina, and all your folks. As you know, it's entitled Old City, High Water. What an appropriate topic name. We are an old city, and if you look at the old maps of Charleston, you'll see a very different picture than what you see today, because many wetland and marsh and creek areas were filled in over the last nearly 3.5 centuries. And in fact, that's where most of our worst flooding occurs, because we didn't have the knowledge and the land planning that we needed as the city developed. So another old part of our city, we had, I'm so proud and love the job of serving as the 61st mayor of Charleston. I think he was the 39th mayor. Henry Pinckney was the mayor in 1839, and he offered a $100 gold coin to anyone who could solve the drainage problems of Charleston. I found that coin in my desk after Mayor Riley cleared it out. We all know we have a challenge in front of us. I met Jamie this afternoon, by the way. You're in for a treat. He's so knowledgeable about this topic and has some great information to share with us. And I shared with him a little story that just the week before last, Mark Wilbert and Laura Cavanis and I went up to Columbia to meet with Governor McMaster, because we were urging him to help us with the federal government get approval for this long-standing mitigation grant that we've had in for now almost 2 years to help buy out some repetitive flooding properties west of the Ashley. And he looked at me, by the way, we spent a whole hour with him, which I thought was great. He asked a lot of questions. He was very interested. He got an education on drainage and flooding challenges in Charleston. but he looked up and he said, I guess Irma was a wake-up call for you. And I said, no, sir, it wasn't. We've been working on this. In fact, I gave Jamie a copy of the presentation that was made just past July at City Council workshop, about a 100-page presentation of what the City of Charleston is doing for resiliency. And I've known about our challenges, of course. I've lived here most of my life, as many of you have, but where it really hit me side to face was a year ago when Hurricane Matthew was coming to town. And it was a direct, hit, even though, thank God, it was only a Category 1 storm when it got here. But the key thing that really saved us was that it came at dead low tide. And so when I was down at the Emergency Operations Center, and we had video cameras set up around the city just to see what was going on. And about 2 weeks prior to that, I, with Jason Kronsberg, our capital projects guy, had been down at the seawall to mark on there how high we were going to build the new wall up to. And I'm sitting there, and it's low tide, and water is coming in over where we had marked on the wall to where we were going to build it up to. And I said, we need to redo this plan for this wall and make it higher and make it sustainable and be able to add on to it and all like that. So anyway, the wake-up call had been made some time ago. And we got challenges ahead of us. We're all going to work on it. And thank you again for being here, Jamie, and Dana for putting this on, and John for sponsoring it. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Mayor Tecklenburg. I really appreciate you being here and leading us in this very important time for the future of Charleston. So we're here tonight to talk about resiliency. The name of the event is Old City, High Water. Pretty self-explanatory, but there's still a lot of questions. I want to mention quickly that y'all have strips of paper that you have been given. If you have questions, be sure to write it on the strips of paper, and there will be a basket passed around. Put those strips of paper in there. It's not for money. The basket is for your questions. So, however, if you want to put money in there, I'm just kidding. So tonight was made possible by Mr. John Winthrop, who I just learned, I hope you won't get mad at me, has been knighted. So Sir John Winthrop, which is very exciting to know a knight. But he has provided the enthusiasm and resources for us to have civic forums here in Charleston. We've had one on agriculture, we had one on mobility, and this one tonight is on resiliency and flooding and how to address keeping our community in this place we love protected in a time of sea level rise and climate change. So it's an incredible opportunity. Thank you so much, Mr. Winthrop. And I'd like to just take a moment to introduce John Winthrop. He is an incredibly civic-minded leader here in the community who has made this forum possible tonight. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and don't hold it against him. And he received his bachelor's in liberal arts from Harvard University, where he later established the John Winthrop Fund for Environmental Studies. After graduation, Mr. Winthrop joined the Navy, and he worked as a journalist, and he went on to earn his MBA from Columbia University and continued his journalism career, where he worked at the Atlantic Monthly in Washington and the Boston Globe. So today he lives in Charleston with his wife Libby and runs his own financial services firm, John Winthrop and Company, also located in Charleston. He generously gives his time to organizations like ours, but also to many others like the American Farmland Trust and the Fresh Air Fund in New York, and those are just a couple of examples. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Windra.
Told Lisa she had a tough job to make me look good. What an honor it is to introduce Dana Beach. Here in our adopted city, his reputation is legendary. I really don't have to introduce him at all. But I think to salute Dana and his team, it might be appropriate to mention that wonderful Teddy Roosevelt speech, which you probably are all familiar with. The only mistake is he didn't mention women, but it goes something like this, and this really is a bullseye, I think, on Dana. The credit belongs to the man or woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and who spends himself in a worthy cause, who if he wins, knows the thrill of high achievement, and if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place will never be with those cold, timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. We salute you, Dana, as I say, it's an honor to introduce you. Each year, we try to identify the biggest problem facing Charleston. Last year, it was traffic. This year, it is hurricanes and flood. And there is a list of 50 things that we can do to improve the environment. Plant a tree, bury a car, plant a tree every day, bury a car, a few other things. And those are mission impossible. And this, we hope, is not mission impossible. But welcome, I'm glad you're all here.
Right, in the succession of introductions, thank you, and thank you all for coming. I want to say this issue is getting a lot of coverage, and there are a lot of good minds and good institutions working on it, and they include the Aquarium, the Sea Grant Consortium, Coastal Services, and the City of Charleston. I'm very grateful that John has been leading on this, and I think it sounds encouraging with the meeting with Governor McMaster. So this will take a lot of people to solve the problem. If John Winthrop solves the problem, we'll bump him up from a sir to a lord, maybe. And he might do it. He might do it. I'm glad he read that Roosevelt quote because I love it. And it really applies to him. Certainly there would be no more worthy cause than preserving and preparing Charleston to survive into the next century, or even really, frankly, as we look at it these days, we wonder even into the coming decades. The challenge is something we've never faced before. This is unlike any urban challenge we have confronted, and so we're sort of inventing solutions on the fly. Jamie Springer is one of the people who's done a lot of that inventing, and he is a partner with HR&A Advisors. Some of y'all may remember when HR&A worked here with the city on Daniel Island, and John Alschuler was down here. We all enjoyed working with John, and HR&A is a very august and remarkably broad-based firm in their efforts. Economic development they work on now resilience planning, which actually was probably something nobody would have even thought of even 15 or 20 years ago. After Hurricane Sandy, Jamie joined New York City's Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency as their Deputy Director of Community Initiatives, where he established long-term preparation and protection strategies to combat the destructive impacts of climate change across New York City. He's since worked in Boston, and he's working in California. Certainly this is an issue that crosses the continent, north and south. He is a graduate of McGill University. I don't think has sea level rise problems yet. And has a master's in public policy from John's alma mater, Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government. I'm not gonna, I was thinking maybe I wouldn't sort of spill the beans or let the cat out of the bag, but I'm gonna tell you that Jamie and Emily and Jason and I drove down around the peninsula today, and we looked at the situation and we figured out what the solution is. We're going to put a gate between Sullivan's Island and Fort Sumter. And we might even close it maybe when the cruise ships are coming in. But maybe not. That was a cheap shot. Maybe not. We're going to put a big fan in White Point Gardens. Big fan that will just blow the water back out when it comes in and counteract the hurricane's wind force. And if you believe that, then we have some swampland we can sell you down in the Ace Basin. Jamie is here to give us a more serious assessment of where we need to go, and there's no one, I think, better prepared and equipped to do that. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Dana. That's quite a setup to start with here. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Sir John for his sponsorship and support. He's a wonderful man I met today, and I got to spend a lot of time with the mayor, who seems to be off to doing wonderful things. So thank you for having me, and mostly I really want to thank the Coastal Conservation League for inviting me down here. I really have to start out by saying I really don't know Charleston. My partner John spent some time here, as you've heard. I got to spend a lot of time here today and get to know it, but Dana Beach's reputation goes way beyond Charleston, and I've certainly heard of Dana Beach and his many accomplishments over many years. So he's the type of civic actor who you all are really blessed to have here. And I really want to thank my other hosts, Jason and Emily, for the logistics and for taking me around today, everyone else who was involved. So as I say, I don't have a lot of expertise about Charleston, and in fact I know we have a panel coming up where some colleagues that I've just met and some that I know well have a great deal of expertise about how you ought to think specifically about solutions. I have done a lot of this work all over the country for the last few years, and I have some insights that I hope will help to stimulate some thinking here as you think about your resiliency. A few observations from having spent a very productive day here in Charleston. You have great challenges as a coastal city. You certainly have challenges related to these major storm surges, hurricane-related events that you've seen in the last couple of years in particular, but also going back to Hugo, where you actually are one of the case studies that we've used in other parts of the country, your response to Hugo and your rebuilding. So you have challenges, but you've learned to live with those challenges. You also have these challenges of tidal inundation, regular nuisance flooding. Again, you all know this, you live with it, but those nuisance flooding challenges are going to become more and more disruptive to lives. And in economic costs, even though the big storm is the thing that impacts us so much and requires a lot of emergency management, it's that nuisance flooding over time that has the great economic impact. So you do have some challenges as a coastal city. Having said that, you're not alone. I'll show you in a minute. There are something like, with a projection of 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, $880 trillion worth of assets in the coastal United States that will effectively be underwater, meaning the first floor will be inundated on a regular basis. That includes $45 billion worth of assets in South Carolina. about 83,000 buildings. So you're not alone. Having said that, what I also learned today is you have an active mayor and city officials who are looking to take concerted action to address these problems. And you have a vibrant civic and corporate sector. I was so impressed and so enjoyed my meeting with the League and with the Aquarium today, who are really willing to support those efforts. And that's what really needs to happen. It's not just the city that can get something done on your behalf. And often in our cities, because we all have busy lives, we say, you know, boy, the city, gee, how come the mayor didn't get that done? How come the public works director didn't get that done? It just doesn't work that way. It takes concerted effort by civic groups, business groups, and members of communities, residents, homeowners, you know, everyone from across the city to actually get something done in the resilience space. But you do have some resources that leave you well poised to take a resilience approach to planning for the future. And I'll get into that a little more, what that means, but effectively, resilience is a term that comes out of biology that references this notion that when an organism is confronted with a threat, with a shock, it's able to address that threat but still thrive. So not just defend itself, but thrive as it moves forward into the future. People often use this term bouncing forward instead of bouncing back. And that's the way to think about resilience, is how to get lots of your goals met as you're addressing a specific climate-related threat. So what I'm hoping to do is provide you with some inspiration from the experience of other cities that are trying to do exactly that kind of resilience thinking. I want to highlight some things about what we know about the risks and the current approach to addressing climate-related issues first. Then I'll get into some of these ideas, how a resilience approach can get you on a more sustainable path than the current approach. And then hopefully I'll have time to do a little bit of a case study of some work that's been done in Boston that I think is very helpful for Charleston as a reference point. Quickly, just about me, we've been introduced, but I'm with a consulting firm, a really enjoyable place to work. We work across the country, and we try to work on projects that bring together resources from the public and the private sectors in order to make really interesting, transformative things possible in cities. We always like to brag about the High Line. If any of you have been to New York in the last 5 years, you've probably walked on the High Line. So we did all the work around proving that there was an economic benefit to retaining that old commercial rail corridor structure and turning it into a park. And then we led the work planning it and helping to get it built. And that's the type of thing that we work on. I think Dana mentioned my partner John, always very proud of the work that he did getting Daniel Island to the point that on the trajectory that it's on, and loves Charleston, founded our firm, loves Charleston, and really enjoyed the time we spent here. In recent years, since really Superstorm Sandy, which hit the Northeast in October of 2012, just about 5 years ago, I, on behalf of my firm, have had the chance to be involved in some very innovative initiatives that have really actually come out of the federal and state governments, trying to use the money that gets appropriated after one of these disasters to build resilience. Not just to build back the same way, but to build things in innovative ways. So part of the New York Rising program, where the governor of New York State created a community-based planning program, actually allocated funding to each of the communities that was planning so that they would have the ability to implement some of the things that they were thinking of doing. Rebuild by Design, which was this national design competition, brought in urban designers, landscape architects, other engineers, other thinkers, to think really hard about sort of big ideas, and that got funded to the tune of $1 billion. I'll show you some of those projects. And then nationally, a competition amongst all those states who had been impacted by a federally declared disaster between 2011 and 2013. And it's a bittersweet thing to say. The only states that didn't fall into that category were Nevada and South Carolina. So, you didn't get hit by a disaster during that period, that's good. You didn't have the chance to participate in this competition, which was really about resilience building and trying to build back in different ways. That's unfortunate. I'm sure, who knows these days, but I would hope that we'll see more of those kinds of things, innovations come out in the future. The other thing that I've been involved in, which I want to talk about, is creating these citywide plans. And we have all kinds of plans in cities. It's very important to do planning. We do land use planning. There is a sphere of planning called hazard mitigation planning, which you're required to do, which is how am I going to directly confront some of the risks that I have. But we've been working within some cities that have been saying, let me take a big step back and understand all of the risks, hurricanes, flooding, but also seismic activity. Some places are affected by tornadoes, wildfire, and then also some of the stresses, poverty, lack of economic competitiveness, lack of affordability in housing, ecological issues and problems, environmental devastation. We look at all of those things together and figure out how I'm vulnerable to all of those things, and then come up with a more strategic response that addresses all those things at once. And Dana mentioned, I was in the mayor's office in New York City, and I was part of this special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but it's really important for the rebuilding and recovery of New York City, because it was this concerted effort to say, what happened during that storm that hit us? Who was affected and how? What will happen in the future, not just from that storm, but from all other projected issues that will confront us, and then what should we do about it? And there were 257 initiatives that came out of that plan, and you can look up the plan online. It's a great plan, if I do say so myself. And those 257 initiatives, they really dominate the dialogue in New York about everything that's happened since. So if there's a dollar or an opportunity to regulate land use, or a way to reform a utility system, or a program that someone is setting up to help people prepare for future disasters, they go to this book and they say, okay, let me look up, let me see what the recommendation was in this plan. And it has spawned thousands of efforts by communities, by groups, by the city, by many others to figure out how to make the city more resilient. And so that type of plan, it's also been emulated in Boston. There's a program called the 100 Resilient Cities that's trying to do plans like that all over the world, and we've worked on that in New Orleans. But that kind of planning process is really important to bring together the understanding of all your issues. So quickly, because a lot of people, I hope know all this stuff, just talk about risk and how we address risk today. Disasters are becoming more frequent and severe worldwide, and the cost of recovery is growing. We've certainly seen that here in Charleston recently. You can see globally, $4.2 trillion worth of losses in the last 35 years or so, 3/4 of which are from extreme weather events. This is going to be a little hard for you to see if you're sitting in the back, but events, this is all the worldwide catastrophic events during that 35-year period. And what you can see is the geophysical stuff has basically stayed constant, earthquakes and so on, a big impact, but we have roughly the same number. But events that are related to the climate and the changing climate are very much on the rise. And one in particular that will resonate with all of you is that sort of medium blue bar that relates to water, flooding, and the mass movement of water and mass displacement from about 300 events in 1980 to 700 events in 2016. So we're seeing a real rise in these kinds of issues. This is another perspective just on the United States as a whole during that period, 2011 to 2013. It's not just one kind of disaster. We've got coastal flooding, we've got heavy rainfall storms, we have in the center of the country, we have storms that bring tornadoes and also riverine flooding and so on. We have issues related to wildfire and earthquakes. I mean, there is a massive amount of climate-related shocks that are occurring. And I had a feeling this was going to get washed out, but I mentioned it already, which is that as we project forward on our coastal edges, we're going to have almost 900 trillion. Actually, don't even know when you get to 1,000 trillion. Is it a gazillion or I'm not entirely sure what it is. Of property that will be underwater by 2100, including, as I said, $45 billion worth of property in South Carolina. And of course, this has been, leaving aside how we explain it, this has been a season that has particularly been devastating among the 10 most active, with still about a month left in hurricane season, I despair to say, in the last 100 years. And we have the impacts of the Stillwater flooding from Hurricane Harvey, the devastating impacts to our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico from Maria that they are still reeling from, and of course Irma, which we have a picture of Miami, but we should really have a picture of Charleston. Altogether, these three storms caused in excess of $200 billion worth of lost economic impact. Lost economic activity from a massive amount of water. So we see that we have a real problem. We also, in the future, confront sea level rise. This is some of the mapping that's already been done here in Charleston about what the peninsula will look like with I think 6 feet of sea level rise. And as I said, there's a little bit of a complex chart, but it's actually very important. When we went and did an analysis in Boston of how concerned should we be about the so-called 100-year flood, which is the big storm that hits you, versus the higher frequency flooding, which is the regular stuff, the king tide, the high tide, the tidal inundation. What you see in the charts on the left is the purple is that bigger storm. So many more buildings, much bigger population that's impacted by that higher level storm when the storm comes, and everybody knows that, obviously, intuitively. The stuff that's more frequent, not as big a concern, but it really inverts itself in terms of economic loss. So in the future, what I'm saying is that that nuisance flooding on an annualized basis is going to be much more costly to our cities than that big event. And you all know that because you're dealing with these issues of poor drainage and the impacts that has already. But it's going to get much worse in the future, as we found in Boston. I presume the numbers look something similar in Charleston. So what are we doing about it now? Well, there's a lot that cities are doing, but when we get hit by these natural disasters, the way it works is that the federal government feels either a high or a low level of political pressure from various congressional delegations. There is a disaster declaration, and they go and appropriate money. One particular set of those dollars, the most flexible stuff, is called Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery dollars, and there's been $50 billion of that allocated since, since 2000. So that's really, apart from the emergency response, the federal government goes and appropriates money to basically help people build back. They get it down to the cities spend it on addressing damage, and who can blame them for doing that? I mean, people get displaced from their homes and they need help, so the cities focus on that. That's not really a sustainable model, basically for 3 reasons. One is, we're running out of money, and I certainly vehemently disagree with the sort of messaging coming out about helping Puerto Rico, but there is a truth to the idea that when you get hit with $200 billion of damage in a given year, you're going to bankrupt your country if you're going to try to keep just building everything back the same way. So leaving aside, whether people should be treated the same or not is a different question. It is very taxing on our budgets. The second thing is what's here, which is we get in a situation where those who get direct hits, those who are getting directly hit by these storms this year, get an appropriation, they get dollars that they can work with in order to try and build back, and those who don't, are stuck in a position where they can't fund some of these things that they need to do. This is Boston. Actually not that revealing when you look at it, but what it's showing is a whole series of near misses by hurricanes over the last 10 years, where Boston, with a little bit of a change in weather, could have gotten hit with a real significant event, but it hasn't. And so even though it's substantially at risk, it doesn't have the funding to go and mitigate or do things that will improve their conditions. The other reason that this isn't really a sustainable model for addressing these sorts of issues and risks is that in our cities, these conventional solutions that we tend to fund with massive influxes of federal dollars, they don't work. They don't make sense. Here's the things that we tend to do. We try to go build massive flood protection system. Dana was, of course, kidding about massive surge barriers because you try to go build something like that. First of all, it doesn't address all the risks that you have. It only addresses that one big storm surge. You're not going to close it every time there's a high tide. It's also very difficult to permit environmentally. We elevate our homes. Well, in cities, we can elevate homes a little differently than this, but this doesn't work in every single context. I think we were talking today, there's a whole set of buildings in your city that you just can't elevate. They're just not going to be able to handle it structurally. And then we go and buy people out who are isolated. But the problem is, there's not enough money to do all the buyouts. And when you try to go buy out a neighborhood, not everybody wants to go, and you can't blame them, and it becomes a very, very difficult conversation. So this approach, that is the sort of federal dollar-driven approach, doesn't work. So what do we do instead? Well, we have an approach to thinking about resilience and resilience building in cities, and I'll give you sort of some principles and some examples. I think I'll just run through these one by one since I'm talking too much. First of all, think about supporting multiple benefits with each thing that you're doing. So this is the Gentilly Resilience District in New Orleans. New Orleans has this neighborhood. It's a mixed income neighborhood in northern New Orleans. It gets hit by, obviously, when they had Katrina, this big surge, but it also is really subject to tidal inundation. New Orleans went and put together a district plan. They did get $140 million of federal funding, which obviously helps a lot to get it done, but the goal is to use green infrastructure in that neighborhood, to incorporate it into people's properties and their houses, to incorporate it into the right-of-way, to incorporate it into a big park that they're building, which will be a water retention park. And so by doing that, they really improve the community, they create great open space, and at the same time they're able to deal with the water issues. They also empower the people in that neighborhood because they're directly working with them in a program that is able to improve and retrofit their homes. Another example, in Norfolk, Virginia, which has actually a lot of similarities to Charleston from what I've seen, the Ohio Creek Watershed Project, one neighborhood, low-income neighborhood that's at the coastal edge. They have funding now, $120 million that they're going to apply to creating a green edge here, a soft edge that is going to address storm surge and regular tidal inundation, and again, create a vibrant waterfront. Maybe more interestingly in a way, is they're planning for another area, St. Paul's Quadrant, which has 1,800 public housing units, most of which are subject to flooding, and there's real issues of concentration of poverty and poor outcomes in that neighborhood. So their plan is, and they haven't figured out how to pay for it yet, but their plan is to find a way to rebuild that neighborhood, buy some of those houses out, naturalize the flooded areas, rebuild housing in a mixed income context, and then find ways to give people basically Section 8 vouchers so that they can go and find housing elsewhere. Not an easy thing to do. It'll take many, many years, but that's the plan. And it's you can see it's a plan that produces multiple benefits in the approach. The next thing, really important, is leveraging regular building cycles, regular capital investment cycles to get people to do things that they otherwise would not do. And there's a great example in Washington, D.C., which has created a stormwater retention credit program. So when developers are investing in new properties, they are highly incentivized to get as much on-site water retention as they can onto their site. If they can't do it, then they can go and buy credits, and someone else will retain the water on their site in a place that it's easier to do or it's more important to do. And so DC has had a lot of success with this credit, and it's been very effective, and it basically leverages those other investments. Another very simple example, and this is something that we're trying to do in New York and elsewhere, when someone goes to replace their boiler, that's the right time to give them a few additional dollars so that they can find a way to protect the boiler from flooding, whether they move it up or they put it in a slightly different location, really all the mechanicals in a building. You don't try to do it when somebody just bought a new boiler. You don't try to pay them to rip it out and buy a brand new boiler. You have to create programs that align these investments with regular building cycles. And so doing that allows you to address those issues. Local involvement in design and decision making is critical. I mentioned the New York State New York Rising program. That was a very effective way of actually nominating committees locally and saying, you tell us, you understand what your problems are, you tell us what we should do here. And in this case, because there was a federal funding availability, it was actually possible to allocate funding to those communities to act on their recommendations. But regardless of that, a planning process where people sitting with maps and identifying, here's where the flooding is, here's where it comes from, here's how it affects us, is incredibly effective in planning for future drainage programs. This is going to end up being a little too complicated, but it's really critical to design projects that allow you to leverage multiple funding sources and improve your cost-benefit equation. So generally, we always think, I'm going to invest in some climate adaptation. What are the avoided damages that are going to result from it, and how much city money do I have to pay for it? That's not an approach that is going to be successful. The approach that's successful is to say, let me look at avoided losses, but also reduced impact and disruption from chronic stresses. Value those things. How much disruption am I preventing for the whole city, which is dependent on a particular area that's affected? And can I create new value that I can redistribute? And then leverage not just city funding, state and federal funding that may be available, and also, frankly, look, people who get value added to their properties or their businesses that wouldn't otherwise be there, they should contribute to these things. So setting up value capture, often that's done through a tax increment financing, it's done through an improvement or assessment charge. That's just got to happen. It's just, city just doesn't have enough money to do this stuff itself. Maybe a very ambitious example, probably not applicable to Charleston, but in New York, where we have the financial district, Wall Street, along the East River that is subject to flooding and sea level rise in the future and was really impacted by Sandy. We've looked at a few different options. One idea is exactly that value capture idea, that we would build, we would fill out. Now we do it in a way that you would do it today, so we try and be as environmentally friendly as we can and do it in a way that we won't induce more flooding. Raise the edge of the new land that we're building out on the East River, and then position that land for new development, use the proceeds from that new development to pay for the improvements that we need to make to protect the rest of the city. And that's just, this is in planning, it's not approved, and it's very complicated and hard to get done. But, we shouldn't assume that, you can never build in a flood area. It may sometimes be productive to build in a flood area. So the other thing that's really important is to think about building resiliency in layers, and I'll just go quickly through this. The first layer, because layers have to have sort of independent utility, they have to work together. The first layer is to know what your risks are, to have updated climate projections. I understand that some of that work is getting done or has been done already here in Charleston. The second is to think about resilient infrastructure and drainage. That Houston, well before Harvey, has been thinking about how it positions its bayou system, its system of natural water corridors, in order to be an effective drainage mechanism, and they've created a master plan around that to make infrastructure more resilient. You have to adapt your buildings at the building level. You need to make sure that you can elevate them. If you can't elevate them, can you elevate the mechanical systems or improve the mechanical systems? And then the city, as New York has done in this zoning amendment, needs to make sure that people are able to do what they need to do, and also incentivize them, meaning that if somebody's going to elevate, you can't take away their air rights from the top of their building. You have to allow them to be able to expand their building so they get back what they might have lost. So adapted buildings, prepare and connect communities, including through emergency management and the type of communication activities that are important. And then I probably should stop on this, which is to protect the shoreline. So you've got, sort of the shoreline, inside the shoreline, your infrastructure, your buildings, your prepared and connected communities, and protecting shorelines can take many forms. This is, I think, a great inspirational example of something called living breakwaters being built in Staten Island. It's been designed by a wonderful landscape architect named Kate Orff, who just became a MacArthur Genius Fellow. and essentially she is restoring this Atlantic-facing sort of edge to a naturalized edge that will include oysters and other sort of living organisms that are expected to provide flood protection. And I haven't seen enough of the problem that you have here, but I think in Charleston, the notion, I mean, it's building up the seawall clearly is important, but thinking about how you renaturalize and you create green space and improve the ecology of the water environment is something you have to do at the same time. And that's something that's really been innovative here. Well, just real quick last thing, because I talked for too long, is just to say that in Boston, where I think there's an analogy to Charleston, very similar type of land exposure and don't have a lot of federal money, they have done integrated planning, Climate Ready Boston, which is vulnerability driven, Imagine Boston, which is a long-term land use plan, and then they've also done a 100 Resilient Cities plan, which is focused on the social issues that the city has. And what we did in Climate Ready Boston was, in a very concerted way, brought scientists together, reached a consensus about what are the future risks we need to plan to, what are those hazards, and then we did a vulnerability analysis. So this is the risks: sea level rise, coastal storms, precipitation, temperatures. You can see, I'm not going to go through these, but very specific projections about what everyone needs to plan to around those issues. And then, very importantly, brought together all of these entities: city, state, regional, county, federal, private, utilities. Everyone came together at a table, sat with a map like this that had their assets on it, and said, let's just start circling things and start doing joint planning for these assets so we can figure out projects that will protect them all. And what it resulted in is that same kind of framework for the projects that all of these entities across the Boston region are going to work together on to update their climate projections, prepare communities, create shoreline protection, improve infrastructure, and adapt their buildings. And it also has had a big impact on the way that Boston is thinking about its future land use, where it's going to grow, because in fact Boston accepted that they would grow into the future 100-year floodplain, that they would allow growth there because they may be able to capture some of the value from that growth in order to protect the shoreline and the properties that exist behind them in that area. So there's a lot more to talk about Climate Ready Boston, but I think the key feature there is that sort of concerted planning, very rigorous, but also building a consensus amongst a lot of different groups that have to act, and getting to the point where everybody's sort of on the same page and can start moving forward. That's the story with Climate Ready Boston. So I've said quite a lot, and I'm very excited to talk about how this might all apply to the Charleston context. But I thank you very much for listening this evening.
Everybody. I wanted to again thank the Coastal Conservation League, Sir John Winthrop and Mr. Dana Beach for inviting me here this evening. My name is Dan Berger. Emily and Jason approached me about facilitating the conversation this evening, probably for a couple of reasons. But my day-to-day job is with the Department of Health and Environmental Control, Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management. There I head up the Coastal Services Division, and usually when I say I'm, with OCRM, it makes me just about the most popular person in the room. But for many, many years, we've been working on detailed, localized analysis of coastal hazards, looking at our exposure to sea level rise and tidal inundation and shoreline change rates and storm surge. And we've now begun translating a lot of that information into local planning efforts and recognizing that the state is generally constrained with its ability to change statute and regulation, but there's great power within municipal governments and the organizations that work within government and outside of government to really influence positive change. So for the last several years, I've been working with some really fantastic organizations in the Charleston area, in a coalition-based effort called the Charleston Resilience Network. And one of our primary goals through this effort is to foster exactly this type of dialogue and this community engagement. So I'm really honored and humbled to be part of this opportunity to have a really esteemed panel of experts that we can just harvest all the really, really good, valuable information and perspective that they have. So with that, I just want to touch on a few local facts for your consideration. And while we're doing this, I do encourage you to write down any questions that you do have, which will really make our panel discussion really fruitful and engaging. So we know flooding is a problem, but it's as much of a problem as it is a symptom of a lot of other problems. It's been mentioned a couple times before that much of the peninsula of Charleston is built on reclaimed land, a bit of a euphemism for marshes and tidal creeks. So in addition to being built on that unstable land, that land is now compacting and subsiding, which makes it not just a sea level rise issue, it's a relative sea level rise issue. So we end up with water standing in areas unable to drain simply because there's nowhere to drain to. It's below the sea level. And so our ability to convey, store, and absorb stormwater and floodwater is really limited by both our topography and our physical ability, our ability to pump and convey through grade infrastructure. So 2016 was a dubious distinction. We set a new record in days of nuisance flooding, or king tide flooding. We experienced 50 days of flooding in 2016. And if you remember from science class, we have 2 high tides in a day. So that's significant disruption for 50 days a year. That was a new record that was set previously the year before with 38 days of flooding. So we're already seeing our scenarios being achieved very, very quickly, which has really accelerated the urgency of this type of dialogue this evening. So we also know that precipitation patterns have changed. And when it rains, when we get a rain bomb and it drops several inches of rain in a given afternoon, particularly at a high tide, there's nowhere for that water to go. Many of you probably were here to experience the flooding of October 2015, in which 2 feet of rain in many places fell over the course of a few days. And we actually had over about 3 weeks of elevated tides in association with that. And that was with Hurricane Joaquin, which was 500 miles out to sea. Just last month, we experienced the 3rd highest record water level in Charleston Harbor at 9.9 feet mean low water for you mariners. And that was the 3rd ever recorded since 1899, second only to a hurricane, Category 2 hurricane in the 1940s and Hurricane Hugo. And that was the result of a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about vulnerability. So that's what we know about flooding in a nutshell. But what do we know about resilience? So we know that it's not one-dimensional, and I think Jamie spoke very, very eloquently about the fact that it truly takes a village. That no one organization or governmental entity or sector has a mandate or the responsibility to solve this themselves. That it really takes collaboration and trust and a concerted effort across the federal, state, local, municipal, non-governmental sectors to address this problem. We also know that resilience is not going to happen overnight. It's a long haul. It takes as much dedication and energy on beautiful October days when there's a nice soft breeze coming in, as it does in the weeks after that acute impact of a storm event. So we need to give consideration about how do we really integrate resilience, awareness, and energy for investment and innovative thinking into the cultural fabric of our city. How do we begin to reimagine what it means to be a Charlestonian, or a resident, or a visitor to Charleston? So I think we can all agree that Charleston is not the same city that it was 50 or 100 years ago. And it's more than likely, arguably, not going to be the same city 50 or 100 years from now. And so how we get from our baseline condition today to that state of resilience is really what your participation in these types of forums and the expert perspective from panelists such as we have here tonight makes it so valuable. So with that, I'm going to give just very, very brief introductions, and we're going to get underway because, you know, really, this is the dream team here. So, Jamie, if you don't mind, I'll let your previous introduction stand, and it was fantastic. Next to Mr. Springer, we have Distinguished Professor Susan Cutter from the University of South Carolina. Her research is focused on vulnerability and resilient science with specific reference to methods, models, and metrics. So what is our baseline condition? How do we measure our vulnerabilities so we know incrementally how are we achieving resilience? So her scientific contributions include hazard and place model vulnerability, disaster resilience and place model, as well as tools for assessing spatial and temporal variability in social environments, which is a fancy way of saying, what are all the pieces of data that can help Charleston understand what our vulnerability is, not just physically, but socially and economically. And as Jamie mentioned, you know, bouncing forward and not bouncing back. How do we make sure that we are addressing the needs of our most socially and physically vulnerable? Next to Dr. Cutter, we have Councilman Mike Seekings. Mike is serving his second term as Charleston Councilman representing District 8 and currently serving as Mayor Pro Tem. He's Chairman of CARTA, Chairman of the Sustainability Advisory Committee, Chair of the Traffic and Transportation Committee, on the board of the Charleston Area Convention and Visitors Bureau, Gibbs Museum, and the Cooper River Bridge Run. Mike is partnered with the firm Leaf, Bosch & Seekings, representing owners in complex construction litigation. He's a former member of the South Carolina Bar's House of Delegates and the Executive Committee of the Charleston Bar. He's also an adjunct professor at the Charleston School of Law and the College of Charleston. And next to Councilman Seekings, we have Aaron Bowman. And as many of you may have actually had a chance to work with Aaron, he's an architect, an advocate for the power of design to build positive change in communities. He has over 12 years of professional experience working with commercial and residential projects of all sizes across South Carolina. He's currently the president of the board of directors for the American Institute of Architects, Charleston, and is chair of the AIA South Carolina Resilience Committee. In 2010, the South Carolina chapter of AIA recognized Mr. Bowman as Architect of the Year for his dedicated service to the profession. He was also recognized as part of the 2017 class of Charleston Regional Business Journal's 40 Under 40. So without further ado, we will get into some questions here. And to make it rather interesting, we'll start with a question from the audience, anonymous of course. So, from your experience, what's the most important thing local governments should be doing right now to address sea level rise? And I'd like to kind of capture that with what would be the appropriate mindset for long term, but what's some of the low-hanging fruit? What can we get started on now?
I'll have that being local. So obviously the number one thing that we should and can and will do in the city is make it a number one priority in everything that we do. Jamie, love that picture that you put up there. If someone hasn't been to Charleston, I think maybe Jared Brown that took it. It really captures it all. I don't know if those of you sitting out there know where that picture is. Y'all know where that is? That's Church Street, looking north across the market. Up Church to the corner of Pinckney Street. If you see the second stop sign and that greenhouse there, that's my house. I own that house. So I've sat and watched the water there for 25 years. And I think, you know, we're here now 25 years later, we need to make sea level rise and both short and long-term solutions an absolute priority. And you know, sure, funding's a problem, but if you come to Charleston, last year we had a forum here on transportation. This year we're talking about resiliency and sea level rise, and the two are inexorably intertwined for two reasons. We need to address them, but what about prioritization? And how do we go about saying how we're going to spend our resources and our dollars now that these both issues confront us. And, you know, are we going to build a highway? Are we going to build seawalls? And are we going to build drainage? And are we going to do all those things? Those are questions that we're going to have to face in Charleston now. And I think that number one priority has to be sea level rise, water, and the first thing that we're going to do next year, it's in our budget, believe it or not, in the city of Charleston today, we do not have a chief resiliency officer. We need one. I mean, just for someone to put something like a Boston 30 plan together. So, you know, talking about it is good, but doing something about it. So, resiliency officer and making sure that every single day, that this is our number one priority, is dealing with this.
All right, thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? All right. Well, I was at a conference recently, and there's a great quote by Albert Einstein that is so applicable to resilience. And he stated, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So, with that in mind, how does a city like Charleston begin to think of innovative solutions that, you know, not only address our vulnerabilities, but also keep the character and neighborhoods intact in the process? How do we make sure that we don't overlook the social impacts of a physical intervention?
There are two things that need to be considered, and these are broader sorts of ideas. The first one is, how are you viewing resilience? I think Jamie gave us a really good introduction into resilience as an outcome. That is, looking at the built environment and how that built environment then would facilitate livability in areas that are under threat. But you can also think of resilience as a process, and that is the learning that goes on to talk about and improve the capacity of the community to understand what it all means. And in building that resilience and using resilience as a process, you may or may not get to a physical outcome, but you will begin to develop a culture of resilience. This nation used to have a culture of resilience, with people helping each other and knowing what to do in times that were not so good. And we have lost that culture of resilience. Many children don't understand where milk comes from. For example, they assume it comes from the supermarket. They don't know where their food comes from. And so building this culture of resilience through this process, thinking of resilience as a process, I think is one important element. The other important element is to think about resilience for whom? Resilience for the people in this room, or resilience for the people in North Charleston, or in downtown Beaufort, or in Calhoun County, South Carolina. And there are differences in resilience for whom, and you have very different questions that you need to consider in terms of environmental justice, social equity, economic equity, and so forth. And then finally, resilience to what? What is the end game? And is that end game you build a seawall and you're done? Is that the resilience to what? Or is it another end game? And so I think these are some of the broader questions that need to be addressed community-wide with as many engaged stakeholders as you can get, keeping in mind that it could be a process, could be an outcome. You need to think of resilience for whom, and importantly, resilience to what.
Thank you. So you might have seen the statistic that Charleston is now the largest city in South Carolina. Last year we added 16,000 new residents in the metropolitan area. So with that comes a tremendous amount of land use conversion. And we've lost a lot of so-called ecosystem service that comes along with forests and wetlands and other previously undisturbed areas. And so when we have that new density, that creates runoff issues. And with puts a pretty extreme demand on the existing infrastructure built to, take the place of that. So Aaron, this one was directed directly at you. So get ready. So Charleston is undergoing rapid growth in its high-density corridor. How do we make new construction and apartment buildings and hotels contribute to environmental resilience?
Well, it's interesting at the building scale. You're working as an architect, you're really sort of confined within your property lines of whatever you own. But we can all recognize that stormwater's not gonna, look to those same lines. So you're dealing with issues that will affect an entire street, an entire community, and so on. So there are a lot of strategies that we know about that exist today that are really perhaps not that innovative. Things like solar panels, things like vegetated roofs, so actually having planted surfaces on roofs, actually do a wonderful job of mitigating stormwater runoff. They create microenvironments for flora and fauna that we're losing in cities. It can be offset in development. Jimmy had some great examples of little stormwater catchment basins that become these nice little beautiful pocket parks in front of buildings. These are all fairly simple strategies that we can build in to our designs, and frankly, the organization that Dan mentioned, the American Institute of Architects, that I'm on the board, resiliency is one of our major focus areas, and so we're working to strengthen our ties with the landscape architecture and urban planning professions to continue to develop this. We have a habit, I think, in a lot of development, sort of globally, to just sort of rubber stamp trees on site in our parking lots. But you can, in those planted islands, you can create opportunities for bioswales where stormwater is directed in. You actually have permeable surfaces so that stormwater can get directly back into the ground rather than having to feed into a catch basin and piped over to a giant retention pond, which is just a hole in the ground that's fenced off and an attractive nuisance. So I think there's a lot of these strategies. We're seeing a lot of local municipalities, City of Charleston, North Charleston, and others, that are getting more intensive stormwater ordinances that are mandating these. But I think to one of Jamie's points earlier, to the greater extent that can be incentivized through development, it becomes something that, for us on the design side, it's easier to sell to a developer and investor who's looking at an economic bottom line and perhaps not necessarily always an environmental bottom line or a social bottom line. So I think those kinds of strategies are what we're working to build into our design and to look at the sort of broader community perspective.
I might just mention a little bit redundantly, but I think just from a real estate point of view, when you have a good real estate market, which I think you do, there's sort of no reason that new buildings should be a big issue in terms of how we make them contribute to resilience. It's sort of Aaron saying, one way or another, they should deal with their own water in such a way that it doesn't contribute to flooding for other properties. They should be at an appropriate elevation that takes into account where flooding is likely to happen in the future. And then there are some hard land use decisions that have to get made about where you allow people to build and where you don't. But frankly, it's sort of like with all the problems that have to get dealt with, people should just be able to deal with in a good real estate market should be able to deal with the new stuff, just get that out of the way and move on and deal with the difficult stuff.
Just wanted to mention, Aaron mentioned, the bottom line, and often when we are talking about effective resilience strategies, we have the so-called triple bottom line. So you have the environmental, the social, and then the financial. And arguably there's a fourth bottom line of the cultural to be considered. So as we're embarking on this very concerted effort, what are some of the tenets that Charleston should be guided by when we're looking at potential fundamental changes to the way we grow as a region.
Well, I'm happy to add that. I mean, I think there's so many different answers to that question. I mean, the number one tenet for any city, and particularly this city, is that we have to be true to the mission of the people who live here. And we have to make sure that what we do going forward meets a 25 and 50-year test for a livable city. And one of the things that we all, I think, have to recognize when we wake up in the morning and look in the mirror when it comes to resiliency, which takes on a lot of different forms when you're talking about it. I mean, you touched on some of them, social, one of them is economic. We're behind the 8 ball. We've missed some time. And we've done some things that we're going to have to go back and rethink and fix. And that really puts up some social issues that come out there, economic for sure, and then some policy issues. A couple of examples. One is, Jamie, I don't know if you got off the peninsula today, but we've got an area called West Ashley. If you don't live here, you've heard a lot about it. West Ashley seems to be a hot topic right now. We have an area in West Ashley where we built an entire community in a church creek, in a drainage creek, called the Church Creek Drainage Basin. There's no way to fix that. We're going to have to go and work around that. We have a peninsula that, as you see, I mean, the water's coming from 2 different directions, from compression, compaction, and sea level rise, but we're going to have to have some strategies that focus on the people who live here. And so resiliency to me, as a person who lives here and serves on local government, is a strategy that looks 50 years out down the road and says, we can continue to live here in our current form, in our current community, but face the challenges of a sea level rise that comes at us every single day. And that really gets complicated. You know, we've got zoning codes that are going to have to be changed. People are going to have to raise their houses on the peninsula. We can't let them get flooded all the time. One of the things, I'll be quiet, one of the things that's really interesting for the last 3 years is we've had 3 major events. 2015, 16, and 17, all of them involved water, but every single one of them was different but had a common thread to it. 2015, we had what I call the turbine rain. It just rained from the sky for 2 days straight down. There was no wind, the water came, and it stayed. 2016, we had a storm that sat off our coast for 11 hours and blew the wind out of the east. And then this year we had, what was it? It was a storm surge. But the common thread through all those, in 2015 during that rain, we had 4 high tide cycles, massive high tide cycles. During the hurricane in 2016, we had 3 high tide cycles, and then during this last Irma, we had 2 high tide cycles where the tide never went out. It stayed high tide for almost 24 hours. And so that's our new normal, in that you can't look at tide cycles. You have to think about how that water's coming at us. It's not the storms, it's the tides. The storms have a great big effect, but it's the tides. So it's so complicated and such a big issue that if we don't start, and the other thing is we have to have economic resiliency. We have to change the manner in which we think about funding our cities. In the city of Charleston, our number one source of revenue is property taxes. On a peninsula of 30,000 with a population of 130,000 with 6 million visitors, that's not equitable, it's not going to work. We need a value-added tax. We need a value-added way to pay for infrastructure. And if we don't have that, we just can't keep raising property taxes fast or high enough to fix the issues that we've got and think forward. So that's another big issue to tackle.
Just say something. To echo that, I think oftentimes we think of cities as their own entity, when in reality cities are a system of different systems. And one of those systems within the city is its connectivity to the surrounding area. And by solving Charleston's problem, it may exacerbate a problem in another area and vice versa. And so you have to begin to think regionally. And within this region, they're actually doing a pretty good job of thinking regionally in terms of economic diversity, some of the equity issues and so forth. But you have to keep at it, because it's very easy to fall back into only thinking of your own special place and not thinking of yourselves as part of a much larger connected environment.
So I think with that connectivity, there's also a tendency towards paralysis, because the problem seems so infinite and so expensive Jamie, from other municipalities that you've seen, here or abroad, where have they been able to make progress, meaningful progress, in not only identifying funding instruments, but actually implementation?
Well, so I can mention a few specific municipalities. Part of my point was that frankly, no one is doing a very good job of doing this unless they're getting a huge slug of money from the federal government, right? And so it's not like anyone has really figured this out. The thing that I would say about addressing the sort of almost inconceivable nature of this problem is you just have to sit down, and so this sort of builds on what Susan was just saying, you have to sit down and start looking at individual systems, understand what the vulnerability is of each of those systems, right? Sort of why are things happening, why are systems failing, what is making them fail, and then look at neighborhoods in the city and understand, very good point with the councilman, that image, why is there water there? It could be for a bunch of different reasons, right? It's obviously a failure of the drainage system, but why is the drainage system failing in that location? So, when you look at that particular place and understand why the problems are being caused in that place, and then figure out a solution that is specific to that place, but also applies to all the systems across the city. And then I think to get back to your point, the couple of places that I mentioned quickly that are doing pilot projects, right? New Orleans, they said, we don't have the money to do everything in the whole city, but we're going to take this one district and really figure out what's going on in this district and try out a bunch of innovative solutions. And it was a district that had a level of economic and social vulnerability that made it really needy. And frankly, I should also say, how does everyone across the country figure out if there's social vulnerability in the neighborhood? By using Dr. Cutter's SOBI. So we should all be very proud of her accomplishments. But take that place, run a pilot, invest in it, see if you can fix the problem there, and then over time you can apply those solutions to other places. And that's where I think people are seeing a lot of success.
So success begets success.
Yes.
So pilot, successful, demonstrated, and become a magnet for that.
Yeah. I mean, another example, just is I didn't talk a lot about New York City just because it's so big, it's sui generis, right? But New York City, we have 500 miles of coastline. Either ocean facing or on the harbor or the bay or riverine. And so we went, after Sandy, we did a coastal protection plan. You can look at it in the book, that basically how would I address coastal protection across the entire 500 miles of coastline? And it's a $60 billion plan. Now, we don't have, New York has a lot of resources. We don't have $60 billion to do coastal protection. So we identified a first phase, about $3.5 billion, and made that the priority. But the way of identifying the first phase was A, where do I have the social vulnerability where I really need to address these issues? B, where can I find some locations where people can contribute to the protection so they have the opposite of vulnerability, they have resources? And then C, how can I find a diversity of different things to do? So this idea of living breakwaters is one example. In some places, you're putting more sand on the beach. In other places, you are building a wall. In other places, you're using naturalized solutions. So that's the kind of approach, is let's try this first $3.5 billion worth of projects, and then we'll be able to see what works and what doesn't and how we can get to the rest of it.
So have any of the municipalities that you've engaged with explored the public-private partnership? Just to exhaust you of information.
Yeah, I think yes. There you go. I think they're all public-private partnerships. And because public-private partnerships are all manner of different things, right? Some of it is, I mentioned in Boston, the planning work was a public-private partnership. That's important. There are places where you have big exposed corporations that are willing to contribute to neighborhood-wide or area-wide sort of protection systems. But look, when we require someone to retain stormwater on their site or to elevate their building, that's a public-private partnership. The public is telling people to do it, and the private is coming up with the money and doing it. And that's the sort of way that everything gets done. Just the notion that government just going to take money and go and do things that solve everyone's problems is just not, it's a non-starter in this context.
So we mentioned elevation and some of those site-specific flooding mitigation practices, but is that going to be enough for the city of Charleston? Is it parcel by parcel interventions? Is it massive structural intervention? What are some of the concepts and ideas that you've been hearing? And I guess this would go to the councilman or Aaron. What are some of the ideas that you've been hearing that will have a positive effect without losing the integrity of the city itself?
Well, I do think, again, there's a lot of strategies at just, the individual building level. We're talking a lot about massive community scale, but for literally hundreds of dollars of hardware that's basically available at any big box, home improvement store, you can significantly upgrade the roof structure of a wood frame home. It's hundreds of dollars. So to your point earlier, catch them when they're, we would say air conditioning, not boiler, here in Charleston. That's what we're worried about. So, if you're re-roofing your house, maybe don't just take it down to the sheeting. Remove the sheeting if you don't have hurricane straps, hurricane anchors. Significantly increases that structure's ability to withstand a wind event, no matter what that is. And then, when you're putting back, don't just put back the cheap building felt. We have this ice and water shield products, new great things that you can put under your roof that also just simple technologies that can significantly increase a building's resiliency. Because one of the key qualities, again, that we look at for individual buildings is kind of self-sufficiency as well. So how do you contribute to your community? Can your building, again, withstand the storm? It doesn't do great if a disaster strikes and only one building on the street survives. That doesn't help. So again, incentivizing and making sure that these kinds of simple upgrades happen within an entire community that has an identified risk, a specific vulnerability that you're trying to address, I think could go a long way.
So I'd like to tackle that just a little bit, if you don't mind. And I think the answer to your question, which is it large scale or small? The answer, of course, is both. We've got to handle things day in and day out because people are affected day in and day out, but you've got to think 50 years down the road. In Charleston, we have a drainage system. It's a surface drainage system that was designed and built in 1850. And there are parts of that system that have never been touched by a human being since 1850. So that's problematic in and of itself, just a deferred maintenance since 1850. But it's a surface gravity-driven drainage system that ultimately leads water out into our harbor. Well, if the sea level rise is coming up and your drainage point is somewhere below the level of, for instance, the high battery or the low battery, and the water's coming in, a surface pressure-driven, gravity-driven drainage system will not evacuate water in a high tide situation when it's raining. That is welcome to Charleston in our lives. When you all leave and go home tonight, we're going to live with that tomorrow, and we will. So we're going to have to do some things like localized pumping and moving water around to make it more palatable. So for instance, every other week or month or year, our hospital system doesn't get shut down because Calhoun Street is flooded. That's a non-sustainable community. In the meantime, we have to think about long-term, massive solutions, which is going to take years and dollars to do, but you can't just say it's so big, it's going to take so long. And I think this is probably my last shot at all this. So I think prioritization is important and understanding what you have to do. And what we have to do as a community is realize that this is short and long term the most important thing we can do. And we start talking about building 9 miles of highway to move people around through flooding areas into a flooded place ahead of fixing the flooding. That's crazy. That's crazy. Anyone who experienced here knows what I'm talking about. If you go look at a map of what happened in our last flooding from Church Creek to Calhoun Street and see the map of where we're planning on building highways, it goes through floods. And it ends on Calhoun Street, which was under 5 feet of water. So there's lots of words to describe what goes on in Charleston in terms of water, existential, dangerous, all those things. What it is it's real. You can touch it and you can feel it, and we need to address it. So for everyone sitting in this room, and for those of you who came to sort of help us think about it every day and demand that we do something about it, and it has to be our priority. Someone came up to me recently and said they were at a city council meeting and we didn't talk about flooding. Well, we talk about it all the time, and sometimes when we're sitting there talking about it, it's counterproductive, but we're working on it. You sat around know that. We're working on it, and it is important, but you need to demand it be number one on our priority list. That's, to me, in the end, how we're going to get short and long-term solutions. And by the way, localized pumping works too, so I mean, just some generators and pumps, they work.
Well, just one last question before I turn it over to Sir John Winthrop for closing remarks. If you'd be so inclined, sir. And maybe this is a bit rhetorical, but Councilman, you mentioned, at the top of your remarks this evening that it's your job and our job to represent the interests of the people. And Jamie mentioned, that no municipality has really solved this complex puzzle. They have great plans, but they haven't solved it. So there's a real opportunity, I think, for Charleston, to be that leader in resilience planning and implementation. But the important question is, how do we harness the energy and the support of everyone in this room and your neighbors and everyone else who lives in your community? So what we really need to do is think of, where are there going to be mechanisms in the decision-making process to really allow you all not to just submit questions on paper, but really sit around the table, have your voices heard, and contribute to this, because ultimately it's going to be your support that's going to enable people like Councilman Seagate and Aaron Bowman and Dr. Cutter and Jamie to turn the keys and to actually get it done. So thank you all for that. I really appreciate being here. We'll be around, I think, for the duration of the evening. Sir John Winthrop.
Just to say, the bar is open, time for a drink.